For this video, I've done something really rather absurd. I've given it a title which is blatantly false. Everyone agrees that free will is real, I'm calling it. Now, what do I mean it's false? Well, you only have to find one person who doesn't think that free will is real, and it's proven false. In fact, it's much worse than that, because I heard someone talking about free will the other day, and it interested me. So I decided to put some question, I can't remember what it was, to Google about free will. And I was astonished at the number of videos that came up on YouTube, and also articles and that, all with titles more or less on the lines of free will is an illusion, free will doesn't exist, and so on. So, obviously, to say everyone agrees that free will is real is not true. On the other hand, I would also argue that it is true. It all depends on the meaning of that first word. If everyone, I split into every one, in other words, every individual, then it's blatantly false. As I say, you only need one exception, and that's a false statement. But if by everyone I mean everyone, the population of the earth, or society, or better still, Homo sapiens. Now, Homo sapiens knows that free will is real because for centuries and centuries he's been practicing it. It's been an important part of our survival, is to make decisions, to make good decisions, act on them, and so on and so forth. It also means we make some bad decisions. And our society is heavily dependent on the idea of free will. The legal system, judiciary system, assumes that people make choices, and they should make moral choices, but if they don't, they should be punished. And in fact, all of sort of moral philosophy is based on that sort of idea. And if you go to someone for advice, say a career analyst, they will say, you've got to make choices, and you've got to make the best choices, and this is my recommendations, and so on and so forth. So, there's two levels here. There's the individual unit, which makes this a false statement, and then there's the whole, in which case it is a true statement. Yeah, that's it. Everyone agrees that free will is real. Now, why then would I choose to put a false statement? Well, it's an experiment on my part. I made a choice. Because I'm aware that things like search engine optimization and the algorithms of online media, social media, mean it's better to say something outrageously false than it is to make an accepted true statement. See, if I'd cut off the beginning bit and said free will is real, I'm not saying anything very new. That doesn't attract much attention. Okay, so I could say free will is not real. Well, it's a bit late now because the bandwagon is well on its way and it'll be lost amongst all the other videos. But if I say everyone agrees that free will is real, it's still got a bit of outrage about it. It's to sort of, what should we say, to make a slogan out of it. While truth stands aloof, trash will make a splash. And so I put a trash headline to make a splash, to see if it works. Because a lot of people have been convinced now that free will isn't real. And so if they see a thing which says everyone agrees that free will is real, they'll be cross and they're more likely to listen to it in order to challenge me or whatever. It's a sort of trick that is used in social media. Now, I'm glad to say I don't usually make those decisions for that reason. I usually make my titles for aesthetic reasons. But anyway, let's try it for this one. It's relevant to this theme. So, why is there trash, trash makes a splash? Why has that become such a big thing? Because we associate it very much with the 21st century, post-truth and things like that. Well, I also listened to a rather interesting discussion. I think it was on the Bunker website, a Bunker podcast. Someone talking about the QAnon, which is a thing we associate very much with this thing. And the thing that interested me, he said, whereas many people have the idea that the sort of QAnon conspiracy theories is all about very stupid, simple-minded people simply believing ludicrous things because they're told they're true by influencers. And he said it didn't actually start quite like that. In fact, the initial people sort of setting this ball in motion, they always made a point of saying, don't take my word for it. Check out the facts for yourself. Go figure. Now, the interesting thing is that actually that's a very powerful statement. It sets something very powerful going. Because if you go out and research something with a particular intent to see, is this true, then you sort of own the results you get. And they're more seductive than if just someone's lecturing you and gives you lots of facts and figures. And I'm just going to invent a totally ludicrous example to illustrate it, just to give the feel of what happens. Let's say I want to make a splash comment on tweeting or whatever it is. So I'm going to say evidence that the Earth is really flat, not round. Now, that means with the internet I could do things which would have been almost impossible in the past. It would require years of research in libraries and archives. But I just put in a query, something about flat Earth or something like that. And amongst pages on and results that come up, I might find a mention of a story of, let's say, a ship that in the, I'm not good at history, 16th or 15th century, set out from Bristol in the UK in a westward direction in order to see if they could go right round the world and come back and prove that the world was round. But in this story, do you know what happened? It never came back. Now, of course, back then there are many reasons you could set off on a voyage and not come back. But one possibility is that the world was indeed flat and they fell off the edge. So I decided, in the spirit of making a splash, I'll put out a message. Ramsay Jukes has found proof that the world isn't flat, and the world is flat. And I put that up. Now, the nature of the internet means that very likely within a day, someone else will come back with something that supports that. Did you realize that actually 7 years earlier, a boat left Portugal going west with exactly the same intention? And that one never came back. Oh. And then there may be a little small trickle of stories along those lines. That's very interesting. Oh, it seems to be building up to, perhaps there is evidence here. And then a different type of evidence occurs. Someone says, it's interesting, I was, following your thread. In the early 19th century, a very well-known and highly respected professor of geography, let's say he's, Oxford University or something very respectable, he wrote a paper arguing actually the world is flat. Now, what happened was quickly that paper was withdrawn and he actually ended up in an asylum suffering from dementia. That was what they said. But it does sound a bit like a cover-up, doesn't it? Yeah. So the sort of waves of examples, everything which seemed to fit the thing, begin coming in, and they could build up to something. Now, the stupid example like that is not very likely, but what has changed? Is this some new defect of the human psyche for the 21st century? No, it's something which is, that instinct is there all the time. You go out to look for something, and if you really want to find it, the evidence begins to sort of point that way and it begins to accumulate. And you value it because you've worked to find this evidence. And so conspiracy theories can flourish in that environment. So, that is an interesting point, that actually if you invite people to research themselves, you're likely to get a build-up in evidence. And what has changed is not that human instinct, it is the speed with which it happens, why it suddenly becomes an avalanche. And that is because, if we go back to earliest times, and I'm sure this was happening then, ideas spread at walking pace around the world. And then more recently, they spread at the speed of railways and the speed of fast-moving ships, then the speed of aeroplanes, then the speed of radio, and now at the speed of internet, which means I could put out that absurd message and get feedback the same day or even earlier. And so it becomes like a snowball rolling down the mountain, gathering facts at a tremendous pace. I point that out, but I want to look at what was being said in these articles, that free will is not real. Now, there's so many of them, I haven't got time to sort of go through and all that. I think I read an article or perhaps looked at a bit of a video. I just didn't have time for all that, so allow for that in my analysis. As I understand it, a lot of the argument stems from neuroscience experiments, where people decided to look at the nature of free will. What was actually going on in the brain while free will decisions were being made? And what was discovered, as I understand it, is that a lot of the processing in the brain takes place before the apparent free choice is made. Now, you can't really test this. We haven't got the instrumentation to test this on an important decision, like, should I get married? Because there's so much thinking about that. It's such a long-term decision. No, what they do, the limitation of it was they choose a very quick, definite decision. And I think this is the sort of thing that was set up. Someone at a table with a button you could press, which would register with the experimenters next door. And they were told, just sit there and press the button when you feel like it. Don't try and do anything clever like setting up a rhythm or thinking it's about time I did it. Just sit there until you feel like press the button, go press. And what they discovered was that there was brain activity that seemed to lead up to that pressing. More than just simply the activity of deciding to move the hand and go press. Even if his hand was already there, tap. And this seemed to point to the idea that something was happening in the unconscious that led up to that decision to press. In fact, they could ask the people, were you aware of a sort of building up of it? He said, no, just suddenly decided, press, I'm going to do it now. And that suggests that what he thought was an instantaneous choice, a piece of free will, was actually an expression of something which had already been decided by the unconscious mind. He was just expressing this unconscious decision. In other words, he wasn't exercising free will. It was predetermined by something happening in the unconscious. Now that's an interesting interesting experiment, and the conclusion is quite challenging. So I can understand why they'd rather, put it out as free will is not real, rather than just research into the nature of free will, which wouldn't have hit the headlines and have all those articles published about it. So I haven't got high-speed neuroscience equipment. I can't work in milliseconds. So I'm going to explore this, taking a much slower decision-making process. Rather than free will expressed in an instant by a single person, talking milliseconds, I'm going to consider a slower process, which is a nation making a decision. And then I'm going to look at what happens beforehand, what leads up to that decision. In other words, I'm slowing down this experiment by choosing a rather different example, and it may be relevant or may cast some light. So the decision what I'm going to look at is a nation voting democratically. And what I want to do is, just like those people who decided, let's go for free will doesn't exist, I'm going to go for, let's go for the voting process actually doesn't reflect what people really want. You know, democracy doesn't exist, we say here. Okay. Now, remember, everybody can mean every single person, or it can mean the whole. Now, the statement that on November 2020, America voted for a Democratic Party is everyone agrees about that. Because you could take a sample of millions of people around the world and you could make it unbiased by saying, is it true that Donald Trump is still the president of the USA? And they'll say, no. In 2020, America voted for a Democratic Republic. Oh, I see. Okay, tick that off. And I think you would, I'm pretty sure that only a tiny minority of people would disagree with that statement worldwide, and even in America. Now, does that mean we can just ignore that tiny minority? Well, no, this is one of the problems of democracy. You have to respect minorities, because let's say it was only 0.5% of people disagreed with that. When you've got 8 billion people on the planet, 0.5% could mean a hell of a lot of people. Millions of people, and even just America, could still mean millions of people don't agree with the statement that America chose a democratic government back in 2020. So, this is the contentious point we're looking at here. Is it true or is it not true? Now, if I put it the way I did for this title, everyone agrees that America voted for Democratic Republic. As before, that's a lie, because I could find people who don't agree with that. So everyone, meaning every individual, is simply not true. Even though everyone agrees, everyone does not agree. So we're going to test this in the same sort of way. What we're going to do is to sound out what was happening before, what led up to that decision which took place on one day. So we're talking days and weeks here, not milliseconds. So you go around making inquiries, gathering evidence, and you come across people who say things like this. I work for this great big successful IT company. Lovely place, very free, but everyone knows that if you want to get promoted, you're not going to come to work with a Donald Trump t-shirt. No, it goes against the culture. And someone else says, oh yeah, I know people who are at business school, and they know if they want to get top marks in their theses, you've got to toe the liberal economic line, sort of, yeah. And someone else says, it's worse than that. I've heard that in some of the deep country parishes in Alabama, preachers were saying, anyone who votes Republican is going to go to hell. God hates it. Wow, that's serious, isn't it? Yeah. And other people will say things like, in this state, which is a Democrat-run state, the incumbent Democrats actually changed the voting boundaries and everything in order to shift the emphasis to be more likely to get a Democrat votes coming to the top. And other people said, yeah, I know people who actually introduced postal voting in a way that would make that happen too. And you'll find people who say, it's worse than that. I know people working for the actual voting technology companies who were bribed to fiddle the results so that got a false truth that it was a democratic vote when actually it wasn't. Now, if you add up all these examples, which might be hundreds and thousands of them if you search hard enough, it begins to be making a pretty good case that America didn't really vote for democratic government. Now, my problem there is that each one of those stories which I've recounted, or that type of story, is actually open to two very different theories or explanations. I've emphasized the theory that what seems to be like a fair vote, which won a democratic election, actually wasn't fair because people were manipulated, coerced, cheated to produce votes which they hadn't. The thing is a swindle. But with every one of those examples, the other explanation could be this, that Americans were so desperate to get rid of the Republican government that they would do anything to make that happen. They would manipulate, they would lie, they would cheat, anything. They were so desperate to make it happen. Now, which of those was true? And what I've demonstrated is that actually if you're looking for a particular result, you tend to put all the switches the same way. And then you get a very powerful argument. I could have put the switches the other way. This is all proof that America really was desperate to get rid of the Republicans. So which is true? Now, I'm pretty sure the answer is the switches are all mixed up. Every one of those single hypotheses is theoretically testable. Okay, did big companies manipulate their people to vote in a particular way? Well, you could run secret surveys and get people to sort of admit how much they felt that they had to toe that line and so on and so forth. It's testable. But each of those single decisions, in reality, some results will be one way, some results the other. A very complex situation that you can't just make clear decisions about. You really have to go back to these individual things, go back to the high-level decision, which is what happened on a particular day in November 2020. And the answer is America wanted a democratic government. So, I'm going to look at this experiment as best I can, having tested out on the slow motion. Let's try and think about this experiment. We trust that they got the results which they say they did. Activity happening in the brain immediately before a decision apparently was made. Actually, the person wasn't aware of this activity. So that decision was an expression of something that the unconscious had already resolved. Now, I don't know in this case what other explanations were considered. I gave the thing where there were two different explanations and showed how thinking tends to go one way or the other. So, what else did they look at? You see, as far as I'm concerned, good science isn't just a question of you want a certain result and so you collect the evidence that points that way, like I've just demonstrated. It should be that you've got one or two different hypotheses and then you put the evidence forward and see which of those hypotheses best fits, and you say, well, that's the explanation that I've found. And I don't know what other hypotheses they consider because I don't know about neuroscience. I mean, does neuroscience include some sort of quantum effects? Do they look for, uncertainty or something? I don't know. I can think of things I'm sure they didn't think about. I mean, after all, when a big tanker moves through the ocean, the bow wave goes in front of it. Maybe there's some sort of effect like that. I'm sure they didn't consider the astrological thing, as an aspect approaches, it's stronger than when it's departing. So maybe the planetary configuration that led to the guy deciding he's going to press that button. Maybe the unconscious was feeling that pressure building up and responded accordingly. I doubt if they thought of that. I doubt if they thought about the chaos magic idea of retrospective enchantment either. No. What we do know is that the decision was that this added up to evidence that free will was an illusion. It had all been decided I'm questioning. I'm not casting doubt because I'm not knowledgeable enough how it was done, but I'm questioning what was the thinking that led to that conclusion. You see, when I said, in the previous example, there are many, many levels here, each of which might be testable. When you put them all together, you've got something much more complex. It's not so easy to come to what it's really all about unless you go to the high level, what actually was voted for. In the case of this example, the high level is the person actually thought he was making his choice and he pressed the button. Now, I tried to address this when I wrote Words Made Flesh, when I was looking to whether, our universe might actually be a digital simulacrum of a universe. You see, on the question of free will, I gave an example like this. There's a man sitting at a desk in his office, and he's hungry. And in front of him is a paper bag containing a donut. And so he reaches towards it. Then he notices the time. It's 12:15. And he had agreed at 12:30 for his lunch break to go out to a nice restaurant with a friend. Now, it's a shame to spoil his appetite with the donut before going out to this fine restaurant. So he withdraws his hand. But as his hand was there, he felt it was warm. So he thinks, I'll leave this to tea time. No, it's a waste. This is still warm. This is at its best, this donut. It'd be a waste to leave it till it gets cold and flabby in the afternoon. I should really eat it. So he reaches for it again, and then he remembers his wife has been ticking off that he's eating too much sweet food, and he oughtn't really to be eating this. And then he thinks, no, hang on. I cycled to work today, and I was a bit late, so I cycled pretty hard. That was damn good exercise. And it's good after exercise to carb up a bit. I should really be having some carbohydrates. And here they are. So he reaches for it, and then he sees the calendar. Oh my God, it's the beginning of Lent. And I did make a New Year's resolution this year that I would cut down, I would try to stick to the Lent principles and everything. So he chooses against. So what I'm saying, again, there's a whole list of criteria here. And you might take any one of those criteria to the laboratory to see how the person responds and work out whether, what is the power of this particular choice is being made. But when you put them all together, you get a very complex thing, which really, the answer is you have to see what the person actually chose. And he'll say, I made a free choice. The point is, you see, that in my example, I was exploring digitizing reality. Now, digitization lends itself to this sort of thinking. If I put the clock back to the conditions before that decision was made, would I inevitably make the same decision? That's what it's really all about, this free will or not. But that's fine if we're in a digital universe, because with checksums and that, you can recreate exact conditions, starting conditions. But in an analog universe, you can't do that. You can never get back to the same thing. You can never be sure, because, it's a choice of infinite number of variables. And from that example I was given about the donut, there's no limit. There are no other things we could consider. You could go on forever thinking of new things. So we're really dealing with an infinitely dimensional space, which is more likely to be an analog situation rather than a digital one. So, what can I conclude from that? I can't really reach a definite conclusion. I just say that I don't know how much thinking has gone into this rather slick, let's trash let's trash and make a splash decision which is being spread over the internet. Now, because of my limitations, I ought really to be fair and consider the possibility that really they were right. Okay, again I'm going to make a choice. I'm going to consider the opposite to the questions I've been raising. Let's say they're absolutely right. They have found proof that when we think we're making a conscious decision, it's actually what we're doing is expressing unconscious decisions. Unconscious material is coming out in a conscious way, and it's already been predetermined. So when these people decided, they're people who are exploring neuroscience, let's do some experiments on this concept of free will. And they came up with the idea, let's do an experiment to see if free will is false. They weren't actually making that choice. The unconscious already decided. The unconscious knows about, if you want to make a splash, bring trash free will. And so to get the benefit of more publicity, a bigger impact, greater chance of being published, and of course the benefits of being published is you're more likely to get funding for an exciting result like that. They thought they were choosing to go for, let's see if we can show that free will is false, when actually it would be determined by all those subconscious factors I've just mentioned. So they set up the experiment, how we're going to do it. They made choices of how they would test it, except of course they weren't really choices. It was their unconscious was coming up with ideas which they then thought they were choosing. And then they looked at these results and decided, what do these point to? And of course they didn't really decide what it pointed to. Their unconscious wanted to get this result that would make a big splash and get better results. And so they went with the idea, this is proof that free will doesn't exist. And they were right because it made a big splash, it's all over the internet now, and everyone is talking about it. Now, so what was presented as a scientific experiment is more realistically seen as unconscious material in a structured way being made conscious or manifested by humans, brought to consciousness, if you like. Now, that's not a new thing. Of course, it's gone back to a time immemorial. When unconscious material is expressed outwardly, we call it art. So that what we can see now is that what is being presented as a scientific experiment, and it is a scientific experiment, is actually a work of art. It's an impressive piece of performance art, and it's rightly applauded across the internet and in articles and all that sort of thing. Great. Now, this does raise complications, I think. It's quite important. Now, I think some people might say, no, you can't say that. I mean, art is let it all hang out, do your own thing and all that, whereas science is a carefully structured thing that's got to obey certain rules and all that, otherwise it isn't science. To me, that shows a complete lack of understanding of art. There are many art forms. I know that there is that element in the artistic world as a whole of, let it all hang out, do your own thing. But many art forms actually are very strictly defined. Some more strictly even than science itself. For instance, a haiku is not a haiku unless it has an exact number of syllables in a certain pattern. Some art forms are determined very much by the materials going into them, like a watercolor isn't a watercolor unless it uses certain pigments in a certain way. And some are really almost totally defined by the technology involved, like filmmaking, a very great art form, where it isn't a film unless it does meet certain physical criteria shown on a screen or whatever like that. And more than that, if you think you can hand in a film script in free form, it'll only be accepted if it forms the rigid format of a film script, which even determines what font must be used. And then all this sort of aesthetic considerations. A film should have a certain high points and low points and things like that. Should have a structure to it to tell a good story. It should use visual elements and so on and so forth. And then there are social things like, how long can a film be? How long can you expect people to be sitting in the cinema before it's better broken into 2 movies? And so on and so forth. Very, very structured and everything. And science is one of those forms of art, one of those schools of art, I should say. In fact, I would argue it's the first of the modern art movement. It came before Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism. Before all those, there was Scientism, a new art form which has rightly earned huge respect in the world. But it's been misunderstood because universities have separate science departments, when now we know actually they should be part of the School of Arts and therefore part of the humanities department. Now that does have serious funding implications, and I think it must be considered very seriously. Now we know that our science is actually a very wonderful artistic movement. So I've now apparently put forward, I haven't proven anything, but I've put forward arguments which suggest that free will is not, it's not so clear whether free will is real or not. And you must choose what you think I really want to say. Now, really what I'm exploring here is not which of those is true, but the nature of this 21st century thinking, which leads to conspiracy theories, sensational, trash making a splash thinking across the internet. And I have talked about this before. You see, I have said that magical thinking, which many people say is nonsense, rubbish, we shouldn't be doing it. It's a sort of like the appendix. It's a thing from the past which should really be ignored. Now, I'm saying that actually it's a very important fundamental thing, magical thinking. And I've explained it in depth in many different ways, but just to sort of give a simple example, let's take the very basic, crude definition of magical thinking. Many people would agree magical thinking is a stupid belief that you can do things that are impossible. Well, that, far from being dismissed, is actually a vital part of human nature. If people didn't do that in the past, a whole lot of things, humanity would have never taken over the way it has taken over the world. Science would get nowhere if it wasn't for some people, like these people, trying to do something stupid, like showing there isn't free will. It's magical thinking. Let's go for the impossible. Let's see what evidence we can get to take us there. And what happens is that science advances. It used to be, when the Wright brothers were going to take off, the scientific establishment in America didn't come to their demonstration because they knew it was impossible. You can't have heavier than air flight. But when it happened, by using the magical thinking of we think we could do it, science advanced to embrace that. You see, it's very important, this magical thinking. The other point I made is that actually it's on the rise. I predicted that by this century there will be much more magical thinking. And I'm seeing this sort of tidal wave of conspiracy theories and things like that as a good example that there is more magical thinking. Now, many people find this very frightening, alarming, post-truth society. But I've done a video, how to survive in a post-truth society. And I'll put that in the notes of where it is, in which I pointed out that magical thinking, if you're going to explore it or question it, it's not a question of saying, is it true, but why was it being said? And if you look at it from that point of view, it isn't threatening. Because you see, it's not that magicians aren't interested in truth, they're dead curious about it. But when you're doing magic, it's whether the thing works or not. Not whether it's true, that's a different consideration. It's analogous actually to science. A religious person might say, science is amoral, terrible, we shouldn't be teaching it in our schools. Now, it's true that if you look at a scientific document, it doesn't mention morality in that. This came up very much with that movie Oppenheimer. Was it immoral to make this bomb which is going to kill millions of people? Now, I think the scientific work they were doing doesn't allow for that. When they wrote their paper, I doubt that anywhere in that paper it said, we were worried about this result and we weren't sure if we should go on. No, that would be cut out for a scientific paper. It would just be the facts, what happened, what was measured, what the conclusions are. Now, that doesn't mean that scientists are amoral, because actually, as you saw from that movie, they were very worried about what they were doing. The same thing applies with magic. The question of is it true is not fundamental to magical working. It's whether it works. And that doesn't mean that magicians don't care about the truth. They may care very much. I know a lot of people really wonder whether spirits are really out there or just something in our brains or something that doesn't exist at all. The point is that if you work with them, you get results. So, the way I put it in that article was to give example. And I chose a very crude example. I went back to my youth and looked at the advertising slogan, Guinness is good for you. And I say, if you begin by saying, is that true? Because we're now in more litigious times, you wouldn't be allowed to say it now, because you could spend years and spend millions on lawyers trying to decide whether that was a true statement or not. Because what does good for you mean? When is good for you not good for you? A hopeless, ridiculous quest. Instead, what I did is let's ask, why did the advertisers choose that phrase? And you look at it, and it's very true. You can see why they chose it. Good reasons. And so I suggest that when sort of these statements now being made, these outrageous things being put forward, like Guinness is good for you, or America didn't vote Democratic, you're actually being invited to play a new game. Brexit looks interesting. Let's try it. People are a bit impatient. They want something different. They don't really want to go to war, but they get a bit desperate. Nothing much is happening. Let's shake the boat and make something happen. Just as wouldn't it be exciting to show that free will isn't real? So people vote for it. Now, if they realized they were actually choosing to play the game, in other words, there was exercise of free will, not because it was true, and therefore you must stick to it because it's true, they have more freedom because they own their decision. If you're absolutely sure that the reason you're voting for Brexit is because everything it said was true, you're stuck with it. If it doesn't work well, and it was true, it can only mean it's been sabotaged by those nasty EU people, by those pesky Remainers, trying all they can to ruin this decision you've made. Whereas if you think it was a game, and I made a decision, I made a move, and it doesn't seem to be working out right, that was my decision, I can change it, I'll make another decision next time. So I think I've come back to the thing that whether it's true or not, this idea of self-determination, free will, is actually very important still in our culture. It's good for you, like Guinness. So I think I'm going to stop there. But I've got to decide, will I post this video or delete it? Because I already have deleted it. First time I made it, the sound was not working, and so I had to scrap it. So if you find you're listening to this video and watching it, you'll know what decision I finally made.